Well, hello everyone. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin and this is Gospel Simplicity. And today I am so excited to be joined by not one but two guests and two people that exemplify the traits that I look for in guests on this channel. People who are not only well learned but incredibly charitable. They have convictions, yet they want to know what the other side teaches so that they can actually understand and engage in productive dialogue. And if you've watched my channel, these are familiar faces. I am joined today by Dr. Gavin Ortlund and Dr. Salkeld. Dr. Ortlund is the host of the YouTube channel Truth Unites, author of several books. I feel like every time I host you, Dr. Ortlund, there's a new one out, but the most recent is Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. A great book. We did an interview on it on my channel, and so you guys can check that out if you'd like. And Dr. Salkeld has also been on the channel to talk about his book, Transubstantiation, and he is also a member of the Roman Catholic Evangelical Dialogue in Canada, as well as the host of the Thinking Faith podcast. So I am so excited to have both of you here. And for those of you that are curious about how something like this came about, as I said, I've had the pleasure of hosting both of these guests. And when I interviewed Dr. Salkeld about his book on transubstantiation, at the end we started getting really excited about talking about ecumenism and method and how we should do that well and how we might engage in productive ecumenical dialogue, something both of us are passionate about. And we began thinking about who we could invite into a dialogue on the channel to kind of show that method in action. And at the same time, after I had interviewed Dr. Salkeld, I believe I texted Dr. Ortlund and said, I've got someone you've got to meet. He described himself as allergic to misunderstanding in our conversation, and I think you guys would really hit it off. And so here, a couple months later, we are making that happen, and all types of other stuff has gone on behind the scenes, but I'm so excited to have both of them here on the show today. So today we're going to be talking about the Eucharist, and I know that this is a topic that so many of you are very passionate about, and so we are going to start at the most basic level. Well, maybe there's more basic, but at a fairly basic level, at a key question when it comes to the Eucharist, and that is Christ present in the Eucharist? We'll flesh that out as we go, what that means and how we might describe that, but at the very most basic level, we'll start with you, Dr. Ortlund. Is Christ present in the Eucharist?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Austin, for setting this up. And I want to say before I answer the question, I've already said this on Twitter and on my YouTube channel, but I really enjoyed Brett's book. It's a fantastic book. I won't go on and on about this, I promise, but
no, please do.
Just two quick things. One is it really understands the reformers and it treats them accurately and generously. I really appreciated that. It's also just very well crafted and clearly written. So I'm honored to have this discussion. So I'll just real quickly canvass my answer to this, and it would be essentially yes. I'll be representing what's sometimes called a spiritual presence view, which is common in the Reformed tradition. It's articulated by people like Peter Martyr Vermigli, Thomas Cranmer, Martin Bucer, John Calvin, people like that. And the basic answer is just yes, Christ is present in the Eucharist or in the Lord's Supper or in communion, we sometimes call it, so that the person who partakes worthily is truly feasting upon Christ and upon his benefits in the gospel. So the emphasis in this view is upon the Holy Spirit's role in effecting a union between the bread and the wine and the body and blood of Christ. And it's a mystical union. There's an emphasis upon the mysteriousness of how this happens, which in many ways I think will be a point of agreement between us. But the really driving paradigm in which it's understood in this view is as one function of union with Christ. And so it's as mysterious as union with Christ. Just as we can't really understand the mechanics philosophically of how we are currently seated with Christ in the heavenlies, for example, we can't really understand the mechanics of how this happens. So there's an emphasis upon mystery. And I just would say that, one thing at the beginning, I know some people will say, oh, spiritual presence, that's not a real presence. That's kind of a lightweight version of real presence. One of the things I appreciated about Brett's book is he pushes back against that and shows Calvin's view isn't a lightweight version of real presence. I mean, my favorite passage is I've been reading through Cranmer and Vermigli especially, but then I went back through the Institutes again. Favorite passage in the Institutes is where Calvin says that in the Eucharist, Christ pours his very life and self into our bones and marrow. Okay? So this is not just something where we are remembering Christ. Christ is very active in the Eucharist. It's different from a Zwinglian view where we're just remembering Christ, or at least that's the emphasis. It's also different from a Lutheran view or a Catholic view in some ways. So I know we'll get into that, but that's just a brief answer to the first question here.
Yeah, Dr. Salkeld, if you want to jump in there, I think people, as you represent the Catholic position, will anticipate that you say yes, but I'm curious to see how you're going to explain this as we go through.
Throw a boomerang right here. Yeah, no, not really. No, yeah, I mean, yes, Christ is present, and there's lots that Gavin said to dig into already, but I'll try not to dig into that just yet, and just make some brief comments from the Catholic point of view. Catholics use this term real presence. And of course, we use transubstantiation, but I would suggest we might misunderstand one another if we start with that. I think it makes more sense to start with real presence and then understand transubstantiation as an attempt to articulate that. But before diving into transubstantiation, I would say, like, what do we mean by real? And there I would say something that Gavin just said, that Christ is really active, and it's not just us doing something with our memories. To me, that's actually the real distinction in church history between articulations of Christ's presence in the Eucharist that are real and those that are not. It's not that it's spiritual or physical. Sometimes we get these kinds of and Calvin says actually a spiritual presence would be more real than a physical one, right? So sometimes those terms can throw us off, but I think that the distinguishing factor is who is the actor here. If the actor is us and we're getting together deciding to call this bread and wine the body and blood of Christ and treating them as if they're the body and blood of Christ, and it's our own community meaning making that does the work, then you've got not a doctrine of real presence. But if God is the actor, if God is presenting himself to us through the medium of bread and wine, or the instruments of bread and wine, or the accidents of bread and wine, or whatever a particular tradition likes to call them, right? If God is doing that, then you've got real presence. And then, I mean, there's going to be questions you're going to want to ask. One of the things that comes up is what happens when someone receives unworthily. Some advocates of real presence will say, well, they receive Christ unworthily to their condemnation, and others will say, well, they don't receive him to their condemnation. But they're both. It's important to see how much they're saying in common. Actually, I mean, they're trying to affirm a lot of the same things. And so a Catholic position will be that, yes, Christ is really present. I would also add historically that this seems to be the more or less unambiguous teaching of the church for almost 1,500 years. I mean, there's little hints in there. Transubstantiation itself emerges in response to a kind of philosophical crisis in the 9th and then the 11th, especially the 11th century in Europe. But those were immediately recognized as out of step with the whole tradition of the church. And when you get to the Reformation, Luther and Calvin have no interest in breaking with the tradition of the church on this question. They might understand it differently, and in a certain, in a new context, you have to articulate it with the tools available to you at the time and in response to the questions that are being put to you at the time. But there's no intention at all of breaking with the consistent tradition of the church that Christ is really present in the Eucharist. So I think that historical element is important to recognize too. And the East is interesting on this because they never really have this fight. So a lot of what happens for Catholics and Protestants is we spend a lot of time and energy making very fine distinctions, and the East says, leave it alone, it's a mystery. Well, actually, everyone in the West says it's a mystery, but we also have to be very clear to avoid the misunderstandings that our opponents over there are saying. And so we have to say something. But everyone agrees it's a mystery, and that you got to be really careful not to overanalyze it or to think you've got God in a box here, So yes, real presence, yes to mystery, and then we'll see where we go from there.
I really love how this has started already, because on the one hand, we have a really bright Baptist saying, yes, like Christ is present in the Eucharist, which I think is going to confound some minds that think, oh, Baptists only believe in this kind of Zwinglian sense. And then we have Dr. Salkeld saying, and we can't put Christ in a box, like there is mystery here. And kind of some of those old anti-Catholic polemics are now going to be kind of confused, like, wait, isn't that precisely what transubstantiation does? Aren't you guys trying to rip all the mystery out? I know we're going to get more into that as it goes, but I'm excited to kind of draw those things out, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for learning here. And as Dr. Ortlund said, one of the great points in your book, Dr. Salkeld, is really giving a fair voice to what the Reformers were trying to do, and I think we're going to see more of that as we go here. So as we talk about the nature of this presence is kind of where I want to go next. Is I think there's maybe two things here. So Dr. Ortlund, you already mentioned that the nature of the presence is spiritual, and you started to flesh some of that out. I know you might have some more things you want to say on that in particular. And then maybe part of that, I'll leave this to you if you want to let that be a separate question, but I'd be curious, related to the nature of the presence, is in what circumstances is Christ present in the Eucharist? Mm-hmm. Does that question make sense, and will that fit in where you want to go here?
Sure, that's fine. Should I dive in on that one now, or unless, Brett, you want to go first on this question?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I'll try not to go on too long. I'll save the in what circumstance question. That actually is another one that, as I've been thinking, especially over the last few weeks, it's very important for us to tackle. So I'll just flag that, and we can maybe try to remember to come back to that. The question of mode of real presence, kind of in what way. What I would say is that if Brett and I were to talk through all the ways we agree, the discussion would be really long and probably less interesting and helpful. So I'll just say, by way of summary, there's lots of agreement. Okay, so and this is one of the points that he brings up in his book. Calvin and Thomas are amazingly close on many of the central points of the mode of real presence. I think people don't understand that or appreciate that as much on both sides today as sometimes as we should. So I want to say that clearly, but then let me just draw out, as I've been thinking, I think I emailed this to you guys, I boiled it down to 3 ways where we do differ. And since sometimes it's productive to just make those conceptually clear as much as we can without yet necessarily trying to argue for one, but just to try to identify kind of where those differences are. So what I would say is, and these are points of historical difference that maybe some of them can be overcome to some extent or another today. I think some of them can. So, but these are historical distinctives of a spiritual presence view where it would be distinct from a transubstantiation view. So the first one of the 3 is that in the communication of Christ to the recipient, the bread and wine do not cease to be bread and wine in substance. The substance of the bread remains bread, the substance of the wine remains wine. And Cranmer and Vermigli and these other guys, when they're making this case, they're making the case that that's closer to the patristic view. They're saying it's the church fathers argue for real presence by way of analogy to the incarnation. So just as Christ is both God and man, the bread is both bread and Christ's body. It's both wine and Christ's blood. It's a Chalcedonian way of construing it. That's their case, and they argue for that from Theodoret and others, and we can get into that. But they're trying to also leave it more open. So they're trying to basically say the philosophical mechanics are just left open. So I think we'll both want to say it's a mystery, but from the perspective of a spiritual presence view, transubstantiation just goes one step further in tightening the screws a bit, because it's got this particular Aristotelian ontology of the substance-accidents distinction. And a spiritual presence view is saying that's a kind of medieval narrowing of the options. That's a departure from Catholicity. It's a departure from the East. It's a departure from the patristic testimony. So we can talk about that, but that would be one of the differences there. The second difference is that for a spiritual presence view, faith is necessary. And Brett alluded to this, but only the regenerate believer actually has this sort of spiritual incorporation of Christ in the reception of the elements. It's not that Christ isn't objectively present, but the unbeliever is incapable of that kind of spiritual reception. So Calvin uses the image of a bottle with a cork on the top, and you can't receive any water. And that's his image for the unbeliever. Christ is there, but they're not capable of that reception because, again, feasting on Christ is a function of union with Christ. So it happens in that context. And again, on that point, the Reformed guys they're arguing from Augustine, and there do seem to be some passages in Augustine where he does seem like he's saying the unbeliever doesn't feast upon Christ. And so that would be at odds with Thomas. Thomas Aquinas would say that there is an incorporation of Christ in some sense by the unbeliever, and even a mouse or a dog that eats the consecrated host will have an accidental eating of Christ, not a sacramental eating of Christ. But the Reformed folks would say, no, the mouse doesn't eat Christ in any sense because there's not a union with Christ. The third difference is this focus on spiritual eating. And this is where I think we can not necessarily see this as an irreconcilable difference today. Now, it depends on how it plays out, because I know Thomas Aquinas has a very robust view of spiritual eating. But this is something, again, in their context in the 16th century, the Reformed theologians are looking at kind of the on-the-ground realities, and they're concerned about a carnal, mechanical construal of real presence. And they're concerned about, so the way Bucer put it, Martin Bucer, is Christ is truly and substantially in the elements, but not carnally or locally in the elements. Now, again, here I think we're going to be more similar even than a spiritual presence view would be to a Lutheran view, because Thomas is very clear that Christ is locally present in heaven. But there are some nuances here that still seem to me to be points of difference. So just to try to flesh it out, it's actually really hard to articulate, but I'll try to get at the nuances by saying spiritual eating means the organ of reception is the soul, principally, not the stomach, though the stomach is involved. There's this incorporation of Christ. It's more dynamic. It's more of a transaction. It's not like there's a very great discomfort in a spiritual presence view with the notion of containment. I've got Christ. The body of Christ is in this wafer. I can put Christ's body on the table. I can lift Christ's body up in the air. Sometimes the language is more of Christ is in and through the elements, not just in the elements, though we could say that as well. Sometimes it will be parsed as a presentation of Christ rather than just Christ being present. And so this is why there was such a concern about actually eating the elements and not just spectating them or adoring them. And also why there'd be a difference on the question of duration. How long does real presence last? And a spiritual presence view would say that only lasts during the Eucharistic celebration and ends at the end of the Eucharistic celebration. So I'm trying to get at the nuances there. It's a really tricky thing to say. The last thing I'll just say to clarify that maybe a little further is that our spiritual presence view affirms that the Old Testament saints feasted upon Christ. It sees the Eucharist as this kind of climactic expression of a more basic substratum reality. In fact, you could even just say the basic mechanism of our spiritual life, union and communion with Christ. That's everything. The Eucharist is the sort of pinnacle expression of that, but not the exhaustive expression of that. So we can speak of feasting on Christ as more than just the Eucharist. And I think you see that in 1 Corinthians 10:3-4, for example, where the Old Testament people under Moses are feasting on Christ. And even in John 6. John 6 is often leveraged against a spiritual presence view, but I would see it as a supportive passage, because I don't think Jesus was saying, you have to eat me to have eternal life, so stick around for 3 years until I institute the Eucharist. I think he was speaking of a broader reality that's ultimately manifested in the Eucharist in a kind of climactic way, but it's not exhausted in that, and that was actionable to his contemporaries at that time. So thanks for letting me just run through those. I know that was a little longer, but I just wanted to kind of lay all that out there for where I see the differences.
Right. If I can jump in, so I think that's like a great like table of contents, an annotated table of contents for our discussion, or at least the first bit of it, because I was thinking quite a bit as you went through each one. Can I ask you to tee me up by like throwing me like a 2-sentence version of the first one so that I can remember what I was thinking when you said that, and then we can do that for each of the three, because I just had some comments about each of them, but I feel like I'll get muddled if I try to do them all at once.
Totally. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, it's hard to recall everything in the moment. Yeah,
Right.
Not a problem. The first one was about basically transubstantiation. In the communication of Christ to the recipient, the bread remains bread, the wine remains wine, and I made some comments about how it's not tightening the screws philosophically as much. Does that?
Right. Yeah. And feel free to jump in here, but I'm just going to riff on this for a bit. I mean, it seems to me the big question, and where theologians, I was super surprised when I started doing my research for my Calvin chapter on this. Theologians from across the spectrum, Catholic, Reformed, and Lutheran, sometimes as a criticism. Sometimes the Lutherans will say, "Oh, look, Thomas and Calvin agree," and as a dismissal kind of thing. What do Thomas and Calvin agree on? All these people say is the relationship between sign and signified, and it's the structure of the articulation of sign and signified is really similar in Thomas and Calvin, but the terminology is different. And so substance doesn't mean the same thing for Calvin as it does for Thomas, and for all the reformers, actually. But what is Thomas trying to do by articulating substance and accidents? He's trying to clearly distinguish sign and signified. And Calvin's going to do something similar with different words. He's going to distinguish between sometimes he uses patristic language. So the classic patristic way of saying this is to distinguish between the earthly and the heavenly, which is much more sort of poetic and just, a way of speaking that's not highly philosophical, precise language like substance and accidents. But that relationship between sign and signified is being a sort of articulated by Catholics and the Reformed tradition. And the one real key difference, as you point out, is whether the bread and the wine remain. And then you have to say, well, Catholicism doesn't quite say that they remain or that they go. It says their accidents remain and the substance changes, which is not exactly the same as saying they're not there, right? It's actually a very precise kind of thing, which might look like overdoing it, if you think that's stripping away the mystery. But it was also a way of saying something really important, which was in the patristic tradition, which is that something changes here. And so how that gets expressed in transubstantiation is by saying the substance changes, which is not the language that the fathers of the church had, but there was a sense that there was a change. And that points back to what I highlighted at the beginning, which is the definition of real that I'm working with, which is that it's God's action. That you can point to something that's different. And if you can point to something that's different, you can say God is at work here. And I think that's the work that the substance accidents distinction is doing in transubstantiation. And when you get to Calvin and all the other reformers that you mentioned who reject substance, well, they're rejecting substance that has a different sort of valence than it had for Thomas. But then they're also trying to do a similar kind of work in their, at least in their sign signified distinction. Probably less so in terms of insisting that something real changes. That's less of a concern, I would think, from my read of the reformers. But that was a central concern for Thomas and the Catholic tradition.
It's no secret that today, perhaps more than ever, people are struggling with their mental health. I think if I asked you all to virtually raise your hand and said, hey, are you currently struggling? Do you consistently struggle with mental health, be it anxiety, depression, or whatever? I think many of us, myself included, would raise our hand and say, yeah, like things get hard sometimes, and sometimes it feels like more than we can handle. The problem is, despite facing these difficult circumstances and dealing with these mental health crises at times, so few of us end up actually getting the help that we need. It might be because it can take so long to get into a counselor or therapist, or you think it's going to be too much, or maybe there's this thought in the back of your head that Christians aren't allowed to have mental health problems. And does that mean there's something wrong with me? Well, from the beginning of my channel, far before it had any type of reach or influence, I have wanted to do my part to help end that stigma. That's why one of my first videos I ever made was titled, "You Can Have Jesus and a Therapist Too," hoping that that would give people the permission to go out and get the help they need without being worried about these shameful stigmas that people have attached to it. Well, now I am so excited to be partnering with Faithful Counseling, who are leading the charge in helping people get the help they need. Rather than having to wait months to get into a counselor, if you sign up for Faithful Counseling, you can be paired with a counselor in 24 hours or less. I don't know if you've ever attempted to do something like this through traditional avenues, but if you have, you know just how crazy it is to be able to pair up with someone that quickly. All of their counselors are licensed and have over 3,000 hours of experience. You can connect with them in flexible ways. You can do video sessions, phone calls, private messaging. It is really fantastic. They even have a live chat. It is such an amazing service. I'm so excited to be partnering with them, and I'd really encourage you to check them out. We're going to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. If you do so, you'll get 10% off your first month, and I think it will be really, really helpful for you. Now, I do want to say that this isn't a crisis line, and if you are experiencing suicidal thoughts or ideation, I would encourage you so much to not go through this alone, but to reach out to a crisis line. I'll put one on the screen here. But if you are looking for mental health help, I think Faithful Counseling could be great for you. They will connect you with a Christian counselor, and I know people come to my channel from a variety of backgrounds, so if you want one specifically from your Christian denomination, they will work with you to try to make that happen so that you can get Christian mental health help. I think it's going to be fantastic for you. I can't wait for you to check it out. Again, that's faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. You get 10% off your first month. After that, it'll be $260 per month, but there is financial aid available for those who qualify. Once again, guys, don't hesitate to get the help you need. faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. Can I jump in there real quick with just a clarifying question for the audience? Because I think many, or maybe I'm projecting, maybe this is myself, maybe I just want the clarification, who knows? No, but
you have a big audience because your question is their question.
There you go. I think it would be helpful at this point just to maybe give a quick definition of what you're meaning or what you think Thomas is meaning when he's using the term substance, because many of us might be a couple terms back in our Aristotelian philosophy courses, and so if you could just give like a succinct way of describing that, because you mentioned that you think it's different than how Calvin understood that term, and I know Dr. Ortlund, you used the term as well when you said that the substance of the bread remains bread. So I think just to make sure we're all defining that word the same, because it's going to be important as we go.
Right. Yeah. Good. So technically, the very precise technical definition of substance in Thomas is that which is present to the intellect. So our senses apprehend accidents. One way I like to think of this is our senses can sift out like adjectives. Right? I can see color or size or texture or things like that. But it's only when I put those things together in that my mind can look at a thing and say, this is the thing that it is. And even if some of those physical elements altered, I would still be able to identify it as the thing it is, right? And so that's what Thomas means by substance. But there's a transition that I explore in the book from the time of Thomas to the time of the Reformation, where substance starts to mean something much more like the physical stuff. And it's at that point, transubstantiation stops working. It stops doing what it was made to do, and everyone rejects it. I mean, there's not a single reformer who thinks it's a good idea. Like it's totally unanimous. And I argue that that's in large part because it stopped working.
Mm-hmm. A quick comment would be, there's this, I guess, question I would just pose that I am not able to kind of fully answer just now, but there's this question of, is this really all? So one of the questions is, how do we define the Catholic view? And I think we got to look at the full span of Catholic teaching in addition to Thomas Aquinas. And so there's the question of what does Thomas mean by substance accidents, and then there's the question of, well, how is it being used at the Council of Trent and other contexts like that. I have this question and maybe this worry of, is the substance accidents distinction, is this all it is to talk about it as sign and signified? It feels like to me, at least at times in the tradition, it's going into overwork mode in going further than that. And I guess I would say we're close here, but it just seems like there is a difference. As best as my brain can conceptualize it in the moment, is that my view is more of a both and. We're saying it's just bread, it's just bread, but the Holy Spirit brings about union. So let me give a metaphor that might help. George Hunsinger, in his really interesting book on this, uses the word trans-elementation, which no one need worry about the big word. But here's the metaphor. And he says again, he's drawing it from Vermigli, and Vermigli's getting it from the Fathers. But an iron rod put in the fire, okay, it takes on the force and vitality and heat of the fire, but it's still an iron rod. There's a union between the iron and the fire that creates a change, but it's still just an iron rod. So that's a metaphor that I don't want to put too much on that metaphor, but that some in a spiritual presence view have advocated for. That does seem to me to be conceptually distinct from transubstantiation. It seems like more of a both and.
Yeah, I would agree that transubstantiation could, at the time that it was developed, the necessary work that needed doing was this kind of clarifying that lost the capacity, I would say, for more poetic and less precise kinds of articulations, right? So we could say the iron and the fire metaphor works in as much as it says this, and here's where the analogy breaks down, because this is not the way. Well, it's originally, if I'm not mistaken, actually, the original application of that is an incarnational metaphor. Christ's presence, God's presence in the man, Jesus, right? And so you can say, well, what it says is true, and as far as it goes, but then it also breaks down at this point. And the Fathers were much more comfortable with that kind of poetic imagery where the analogy didn't have to be perfect in every respect. And the state of the question, in the High Middle Ages just demanded great precision. And I think Thomas does a great job of this, but then there's a loss. There's a loss of this kind of poetic imagery, because then you get really careful about saying the accidents or the species instead of just saying bread and wine, which Paul, could have been much more cavalier about, just using that language. So I think that's one thing that's going on, that Catholics should not be overly suspicious if an analogy isn't perfect, because no analogies actually are, by the way, because this touchstone in our own tradition emerges in a very particular context that demands a kind of precision. So that's one thing. But then a second thing I would say, and I'm not sure if you were going to this, but I was picking up hints of it. There's also in transubstantiation, I would say since Trent, a kind of there's a temptation to make it mean more and more all the time. And this happens on a whole range of issues, where the Catholic distinctive starts to be articulated as a kind of anti-Protestant way of speaking. And so you end up, one example I know is this document, I don't know, it's 18th century English Catholics who are really pushing back against, the dominant Protestantism. And there's a book that is the 12 miracles of transubstantiation. And each one is more anti-Protestant than the next, Well, Thomas says there's one miracle, and he's very clear on this point. And there's this sort of need to really amp it up, because it becomes this identity marker. And so I think it can sometimes be sort of overwrought or overinterpreted in part. And I think this actually happens on both sides, actually. For the last 500 years, even the doctrine of justification, some Protestant versions of it are just anti-Catholicism, and Catholic rejections of Luther are often just really overshoot the mark, because it's just bound up with identity and everything else. So I think there is some of that going on as well. I don't know if that if you have a further specifying question, because I feel like I answered part of what you're asking.
Right, right. Well, and I appreciate what you're saying about kind of each tradition has at times defined itself in over and against the other. And I take a view of principled ecumenism where we don't compromise anything, but we dialogue with an open heart, with charity to see maybe we did misunderstand one another at points. And I have to say, you wouldn't think, but I do think there are times where the traditions are talking past each other at points where I do think we can make progress. And that's not a naive thing of, all these differences don't matter and we can just sweep them all away. We've got sticking points that I know we'll get to. But I appreciate what you're saying there. I was curious maybe to give you a chance to comment if you wanted to on some of the other ones about only the believer eats Christ, my second point, or the spiritual eating, the third point, which I know we've got some commonalities there.
Right. Yeah, so the second one, I mean, the fascinating thing historically is the big question about whether only the believer eats Christ wasn't a hot button topic for Catholics. It was a hot button topic between Protestants, right? It was Lutherans insisting that if the presence you're talking about is really real, then the unbeliever receives Christ and eats Christ. And the Reform pushback was no, they don't. And we can have a real presence without having that implication sort of built in. And what I ended up finding at the end of my book, I wasn't sure what to do with this. I was sort of surprised myself when I found this. The distinctions that Lutherans and Reformed were going back and forth on this. Thomas Aquinas makes this argument. Interestingly, he says, does the unbeliever receive sacramentally? And he says it depends on what you're applying your adverb to. If you're applying your adverb to the Eucharist, then yes, because I want to be able to say that he's really there. And that's not dependent on, see, this was the Lutheran concern about the Reformed, right? If you say no, then you're saying the presence is dependent on the faith of the believer rather than on the act of God, and that won't cut it. And no matter how much Calvin and the other reformers pushed back and said that's not what they meant, the Lutherans weren't buying. And Thomas says, if you're applying the adverb sacramentally to the Eucharist, then yes, which is somewhat analogous, as you pointed out, to him even saying, a dog or a mouse receives at least accidentally, right? Because he wants to insist there's something real in the elements that has changed. But then he says, if you apply it to the believer, if your adverb sacramentally is applied to the believer, then no, they don't receive. So it looks to me like Thomas is I'm biased maybe, but it looks to me like Thomas walks the line between the Reformed and Lutheran positions on this, so that he's able to say that yes in a way and no in another way, which reading the disputes, between Calvin and is it Westphal? They're hundreds of pages long, and they just circle around this point over and over. And it feels like we would all actually agree that if we're talking about the element, then yes, and if we're talking about the believer, then no. I think. Am I crazy? I don't know.
And if you ever think that you've outsmarted Thomas Aquinas, just wait, because he will have another distinction to say, but let us distinguish in this way, and then you realize, I didn't, but yeah, that's an interesting point of difference. I think again, just the rationale for the spiritual presence view would be union with Christ being the sort of broader context in which the feasting with Christ happens, so that the mouse is not united with Christ mystically by faith.
Right.
So therefore, the mouse is not eating Christ in any sense, not even in an accidental sense. And so the other sacrament or preaching even could be an analogy here, where a lot of people would recognize that it's not that someone who believes in baptismal regeneration might still acknowledge the unbeliever might not be regenerated if they are rejecting God in their heart while being baptized. So Calvin's metaphor of the cork on the bottle to me is reasonable in that you're saying, Christ is there. It's just that he can be rejected, in which case you're just eating and drinking judgment upon yourself.
I think Calvin's metaphor, he also has another one where he talks about the rock that's impermeable to rain or something like that. And it just runs off. And I don't see a Catholic having any problem with those metaphors. I mean, I think they work. And one really important thing about the Reformed tradition, which comes up, I think, in your third point, which is it's not just about receiving Christ, but it's receiving Christ and his benefits. It's not a limited kind of reception where it's you do it because you're told you're supposed to, or that it's just a kind of contained thing, but it's actually expressive of a broader relationship. And I think an underappreciated element of Thomas's teaching is that the body and blood of Christ that are present in the Eucharist are only the second step, right? He's got this tripartite schema where the first step is the sign, and the second is this what he calls the sign and the thing, which is the body and blood of Christ. So they are signified by the bread and wine, which is the sign, but they in turn signify something greater, which is the he calls the thing itself, the res tantum, and it's variously the unity of the church, the forgiveness of sins, all this kind of stuff that I think Calvin is interested in when he talks about the benefits. The Eucharist isn't for its own sake. It actually has a dynamism that points beyond itself, ecclesiologically to the unity of the church, the incorporation of the believer into Christ, but even eschatologically, there's this sense of the foretaste of the heavenly banquet and all of that kind of stuff. And a risk of a Catholic focus on transubstantiation is to kind of make the sacramental presence of the body and blood of Christ an end in itself, which is not actually what Thomas was trying to do. And I think Calvin and other reformers draw out, well, I think they were looking at the practice of contemporary Catholics who seemed to make the Eucharist an end in itself and wanted to draw people into a broader context for understanding it. And I think Aquinas would have been happy to have them do that work.
Yeah. Could I ask you this, Brett? And let me start by saying 100% full acknowledgement that contemporary Protestant practice, particularly evangelical practice, has lots of work to do. Okay. So I want to really acknowledge my tradition's weaknesses. But would you acknowledge some legitimacy to the Reformers' concerns in terms of the infrequency of reception of the elements, not receiving the elements in both kinds, bread and wine, sometimes a superstition that would come in, if I get the host and I can put a bit of it in my garden, my crops will be better this year. I'm not saying that's Catholic teaching, but the Reformers were seeing real dysfunctions. And do you see some legitimacy to what they're saying? Because that seems consistent with what you were just saying.
Absolutely. I mean, on the first point you mentioned was frequency. Catholics are shocked when they hear, Calvin, originally advocated for weekly communion. But the people of Geneva just couldn't take that. Was just too radical. So he settled for quarterly. So then when Catholics encounter Protestants who follow Calvin by receiving quarterly, and they say, well, they must not be very serious about the Eucharist if they only receive 4 times a year. And what they don't know is that was 4 times as often as most Catholics were receiving at the time, right? So on frequency, we've really shifted since then. I mean, it was really about 100 years ago under the papacy of Pius X where that really started to shift to weekly or even daily. I mean, today the most devout Catholics receive. Well, I don't want to say they're the most devout because there's some very devout people who have families and day jobs that mean daily communion is not always possible. But some of the most Catholics will receive almost daily, right? So certainly on frequency, contemporary Catholic sensibilities is much more in line with the Reformers than with the practice of the Catholic Church at the time. The receiving in both kinds, again, I would say, I feel like Trent was a missed opportunity there. Trent was considering it. It was seriously debated, and it was sort of rejected as inopportune right now. And I haven't studied exactly what that means, but my gut tells me that means giving too much ground to the heretics, actually. Like, I wonder if that wasn't part of the concern, and certainly I advocate for receiving in both kinds whenever possible. I mean, there are particular circumstances, I know about, like downtown parishes where anyone just walks in, that if you have free alcohol available, it's a bad idea. I mean, or COVID, right? Receiving from the same cup during COVID. Okay, fine. And I grant the legitimacy of receiving under just the one species when necessary, but it's not what Jesus told us to do, like very clearly, right? And then what was the third? Oh, and then the superstitions. And I would say 100%, like my own, when I discovered this topic for my dissertation, this started out as my doctoral dissertation, it was when I realized my own misapprehension of the doctrine. I had misunderstood things, and I had embarrassed myself with sort of post hoc rationalization to pointed Protestant questions, like, well, what happens? If he's really present, does he just end up in the toilet? Mm-hmm. And then a Catholic has to be like, well, he could unconsecrate it when he wants to. Well, sure he could, but that's not what the tradition says at all. That just imagines a completely unsacramental kind of view, and I think, but I'll make a broader point which reflects on your point about evangelical practice too. That practice often tells us more about what people believe than the theology they ostensibly adhere to. And so we need to really attend to practices, because people will believe about the Eucharist what they see enacted in their communities, right? And so, what do you do with leftovers is not only a philosophical question about whether Christ remains or not. It's actually a question about what are you communicating to the people who receive the Eucharist if it ends up in the garbage? Like, what does that actually say? And I think liturgical practice, I would say, well, the solution is put it in a gold box, that's what Catholics do. But of course, that comes with its own potential misunderstandings, right? So you have this fine balance of, you need practices that actually communicate what you're trying to communicate with your preaching and theology on the one hand, and you have to recognize that whatever practice you choose, there's always going to be potential for misunderstanding in one direction or another, and you want to kind of mitigate that. And I think one of the great things about ecumenical dialogue is we can accept the concerns that others have about our practices without necessarily saying, yes, our theology always leads to that, therefore we need to change our theology. Mm-hmm. No, our theology we can still say is good, but we need to be aware of the ways it might be misinterpreted, because every attempt to describe a mystery is going to lead to some potential misunderstanding in one direction or another. And it's good to be aware of which misunderstanding is most prevalent in your own articulation so you can counter it, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, and even just realizing how we're coming across can help us see some maybe a weakness in our practice or in our theology, where it's actually amazing to me how much we can be enriched in the context of dialogue, even if we don't change our mind, even if there's that view, there's this view, but I'm still a better person, a better thinker, a better Christian because we talked, So that's another one of the values of dialogue. Would it be useful to push things forward if I were to speak just briefly to the in what circumstance question? I don't want to push this forward too quickly, though, Austin. I don't know where you want to take us here.
If you're anything like me, you might have this vague sense that you should be investing, or maybe you actively want to invest, but you just find the whole thing a little confusing. I've been there. I totally get that. Between wondering what should you buy and where should you invest, which companies do you pick and when do you pick them, and on top of all of that, how do you know that your money isn't going to be supporting companies that are against your moral values? To be honest, it's all very complex, but that is where Christ-centered capital comes in. C3. C3 is an organization that exists to help you not only be a good steward of your money and be able to invest wisely by giving you timely stock picks, mock portfolios, even alternative investing opportunities like crypto and all of that and so much more, but they do it in a way that gives you ratings of these companies based on what they are supporting and whether or not they would line up with Christian moral convictions. It's amazing, it's so helpful, and allows you to take that investing to a more conscious level and see, is this really something that I would want to be supporting? I highly recommend you check them out, and you can do so by going to christcenteredcapital.com. And if you do, be sure to use the promo code C3Austin for your first month absolutely free. You don't even have to pay anything. You can see if you like it, see what kind of services they offer you. After that, it would be $7 per month. And just so you know, 50% of those profits will be going back into Christian organizations like pro-life organizations, Christian colleges, and much, much more. They're a great organization that I'm so happy to be partnering with. And again, I'd encourage you to check them out at christcenteredcapital.com and use the promo code C3Austin to get your first month free. Yeah, I think In What Circumstance is a great point to go to kind of continue in the kind of deep theological questions here. And then from there, I have, I think, separate questions I want to ask you all, for you, Dr. Ortlund, on practice, because I think Dr. Salkeld brings up a good point and something I think you'll actually be excited to talk about as you try to draw Protestants back to historic Protestant sources in a lot of your work. And then Dr. Salkeld, I think people might have some questions about what does a Catholic have to affirm about this? But let's start with the In What Circumstances to kind of continue to dig into the root issues there.
Okay, thanks for letting me speak to this, because this is a little bit different from the previous question of in what way is Christ present. But as I've thought about this one surprised me as actually another area that I see as one of those sticking points where, no matter how generous we try to be in understanding one another, we sort of reach a wall here. Because basically, as I understand it, the Catholic position would be that a valid Eucharist requires valid ministry, a valid presiding minister. And that's not going to be happening even for the Anglicans, because their apostolic succession is not valid. And so I guess let me share an anecdote. When I preached on the Lord's Supper and on baptism several months back, trying to help our church grow in our understanding of these things, and I shared an opening illustration that was just about, the point of it was not this stuff, it was more just the importance of the Lord's Supper, but it was about Lutherans in a concentration camp partaking of the Lord's Supper. And they didn't have any minister whatsoever. And they had to do it in a sort of clandestine way to not attract the attention of the guards. So they didn't really even have a prayer of consecration proper. But I would say that Christ would honor that. So in other words, my position on In What Circumstances is, I would say that wherever there is true faith in Jesus Christ, there is the potential for a valid and true Eucharist. And as I've studied this issue, I've been surprised that the issues of transubstantiation aren't actually where necessarily the deepest nerve centers go to. It's more the exclusivity of the Catholic position that, unless I misunderstand, would say, I've never had the Eucharist. I'm not even a part of the church. I don't have a valid Eucharist. And it's not a sentimentalism that recoils against that. It's not an emotionalism. Sometimes it's I think, a pretty valid concern here. And I would just say, to me, whether you think of those Lutherans in the concentration camp or you think more broadly, I don't mean to give a real emotional illustration to make the point, but it just seems to me to be unconvincing. This more mechanical and institutional way of thinking, where's valid ministry and therefore where is a valid Eucharist. And so that's just that's a part of this whole conversation that I want to make visible, and maybe we can kick it around.
Yeah, no, that's great. I give me a second. I'm going to grab a book off my shelf because I went into this a little bit in my first discussion with Austin, and some people in the comments went after me pretty hard. So I'm going to quote Ratzinger to protect myself here. Give me half a second.
Always a smart thing to do.
Yeah, I'll grab Ratzinger and it'll silence the comments.
So okay, before I quote the Ratzinger, I'll just give a little bit of background. And make sure I got the right page here. Yeah, so those who are following along, this is Pilgrim Fellowship of Faith, the Church's Communion by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. It's a collection of like occasional speeches and essays and stuff. It wasn't written as one book. And this is page 248. It's an exchange of letters between an old friend of Ratzinger's, a Lutheran bishop named Hanselman. And so I'll read it in just a second. But what I would say more generally first is I think Catholicism is struggling to articulate in what sense Protestant orders are orders, and in what sense a Protestant Eucharist is Eucharist. Under a certain kind of categorization, we can say there's simply nothing. It's play acting, right? So if you dress up like a bishop, well, you're playing dress up. You're just there's no difference in a certain way of categorizing this between a kid who dresses up as a bishop for Halloween and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Like it's just null and void, right? And we have this language in our tradition, null and void, with respect to Anglican orders in 1893, I believe. It seems to me this is so. I can get in trouble here, but it seems to me this is clearly inadequate. The Pope does not treat the Archbishop of Canterbury as anything but a bishop. I mean, it's just how the Catholic Church treats bishops in other Christian communities. It treats them as bishops. That doesn't mean we think they're exactly the same in their relationship to the Apostolic Church or anything else, but it does mean we don't treat them like lay people who are playing dress up, right? And as you point out, our attitude on the question of orders, it will then sort of filter down into our attitude about the validity of the Eucharist. And it seems to me, now here's where I get speculative. This is, if I had to write a second doctorate, this would be my topic. I think Vatican II actually gives us the very fruitful categories for thinking about this. When it moved from just describing non-Catholics as either heretics or schismatics to being described as separated brethren, and what it said was that there is anyone who's baptized has a real communion with the Catholic Church. That's why we wouldn't rebaptize you if you became a Catholic, because we recognize you are already baptized into a real relationship with the Catholic Church. And the language of Vatican II is that communion is real but imperfect. And it seems, and now that's kind of open-ended. It doesn't say how imperfect or in what ways or what the specific lack is or whatever. And maybe there's room for some specification there, and maybe sometimes it's not necessary. But it seems to me that phrase, real but imperfect, actually makes a lot of sense out of actual Catholic practice and attitudes towards Protestant orders and Protestant Eucharists. For instance, if you're an ordained minister, if you were to become Catholic, Gavin, you could be ordained a Catholic priest in the Western Rite despite the fact that you're married. I can't do that. Now, if we were to judge and say, well, our academic qualifications or whatever are pretty similar, but there's something different about Gavin than about Brett that allows him to be ordained a Catholic priest and not Brett, despite the fact they're both family men. What is it? Well, I think there's no disputing. It's the fact that you're ordained in another communion. It just, in practice, that's just what happens. And so I think Catholics have to really work on this. And I think that the best way to describe the Catholic attitude towards Protestant Eucharist is that, like, we need to profess our ignorance. We actually don't know how to describe what's going on there because it's outside of the categories we've used to describe it. But we actually don't act like or think that it's nothing. We don't think it's play acting. And so now, with all that, I'm going to read you the quote from Ratzinger. So Hanselman had asked him the question that you're asking me in a way, right? And Ratzinger says, I reckon as one of the important results of ecumenical conversations, particularly the realization that the question of the Eucharist cannot be restricted to the problem of, and he puts it in quotes, validity. Even a theology along the lines of the concept of succession, as is in force in the Catholic and in the Orthodox Church, should in no way deny the saving presence of the Lord in the evangelical. Now, in the German context, evangelical means Lutheran. He's talking to a Lutheran bishop. Saving presence of the Lord in the evangelical Lord's Supper. The place of the Eucharist is, of course, seen differently within the framework of the ecclesiology of the Reformed tradition from how it is seen in the Catholic and the Orthodox tradition. There is no doubt that the dialogues still have a great deal of work before them here. Yet this difference and the questions it implies cannot diminish what has so far been found on the path of ecumenism. So if I'm getting a little speculative, I'm not doing it out of nowhere. I think the Catholic tradition acknowledges that this is a real question to us and that our own practice doesn't line up perfectly with our easily understood kind of pop version of the Protestant orders are just nothing.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you're saying there, especially from Ratzinger and the movement that I see in thoughtful Catholics on questions like this. It seems to me that that movement still has further moving to do in terms of where we're going to be able to see Christ in one another and come together. But it's good to keep working at that. So
yeah,
thank you for addressing
I would agree. There's work to do, but I think it's the popular framing of it as an all or nothing is actually not available to us. I think like the direction we're going is pretty clear, and it's not just wild liberal speculative theologians. It's like the Pope, you know.
That's really helpful. I think that's a great touch point, and also another great example of ecumenism in motion, if you will. Seeing that and seeing it in an unfinished state where there's still wrestling and there's not necessarily full clarity there, and we want to see more happen, but yet we can see certain trends and speculate, but not on terribly loose grounds as to where that might go. I'm excited by that. We can keep going on that if there's more you want to say, or if there's anything else you want to say, Dr. Salkeld, about in what circumstances is Christ present. I don't know if that was more a response to Gavin or if that kind of suffices as your answer there. Is there anything else you want to say there?
Well, I'll just say, because I originally interpreted the question to mean something else, which was, because this was a question at the time of the Reformation too, is Christ present in the elements beyond the celebration? Right? So we would all proponents of real presence think Christ is present while the Eucharist is being celebrated. A big question has been, what do you do after, with the leftovers, so to speak, right? And so I had originally conceived of the question along those lines. So I'll just share just briefly that Catholic piety developed this practice of keeping the Eucharist in a tabernacle, which can be visited, not during Mass, and prayed before, and there's elements of Eucharistic piety, adoration, and that sort of thing. It develops out of the early church's practice of reserving some of the Eucharist for the sick who couldn't be present at the community celebration. So that was the original seed of it. And then the question was, well, how do you behave towards it if it's here? And one of the things that happens in the Reformation is there's debates. Different Protestants treat this differently. Well, you can't throw it in the garbage. Well, some say you can throw it in the garbage. The ceremony's over, so it's not the body of Christ anymore. Other people say, no, you can't, so you better eat all of it, right? That's like the non-controversial solution, right? No one can really complain about that. And by the way, that's what Catholics do with the species of the wine, right? We don't keep that. So, I mean, in principle, Catholics can accept that. And then there's even, was it you, Austin, or someone who was sharing with me that maybe it was Jonah Saller, the theological arsonist, who encountered, I think it was a Lutheran church that had the plumbing that went straight into the ground instead of into the sewer, so that when you rinse the chalice, it doesn't go into the sewer. It goes in directly into the ground, which is a practice in some churches, Catholic and Protestant, is to have specific plumbing that doesn't go straight to the sewer, because of this recognition that something is going on. The Catholic principle for how long it lasts is as long as you can read the sign. So that applies to anything left in a tabernacle. That applies to, liquid on the inside of a cup. That applies to what's happening in your stomach, right? Once bread is digested to the point where you would not recognize it as bread, then you would no longer call it the body and blood of Christ. But Catholicism says if this change is real, but sacramental, then the reality of it persists as long as the sacramental sign persists. So that's a whole other take on your question. I think Gavin's take was probably the correct one and the more interesting one, but there it is.
I think that's helpful. Dr. Ortlund, is there anything you want to say about the duration of the presence? I think you've mentioned it before as kind of confined to this celebration. I think that's what you said earlier, but is there anything you'd like to add there?
Briefly, the practice that I think is most commendable is a reuse of the elements, but I would hold the view that it is not dishonoring Christ if they are disposed. And the reason for that is, again, a concern about an overly mechanical equation or static sense of containment in the nature of real presence. And the view that I would take, thinking of the iron and the fire or something else like that, it's more dynamic, so that there's not a perception that Christ is present in the elements after the Eucharistic celebration is over. And so if the bread goes stale, it doesn't necessarily dishonor Christ for that to be disposed of. That would be the position that I would take.
All right, thank you for that. So I think it would be interesting here to get a little into practice for Dr. Ortlund here. And then Dr. Salkeld, I want to maybe anticipate a question that might come up from some of my Catholic viewers, and I think it came up in our last interview, because this is the impression I get, that a lot of the people that come to my channel are evangelical converts to Catholicism, and in so doing, they become very passionate maybe about defining themselves by what they're not at times, so distinguishing from where they came from and really wanting to separate that distance. And when they see you showing that there's actually significant overlap, it can create some discomfort, and I get that. That's fine, but I think this is a process of learning and getting more nuanced. But I think another question that kind of came up sometimes was, it seems like Dr. Salkeld's willing to say, yeah, like transubstantiation wasn't working for a time. They weren't expressing it correctly, or there were abuses in Eucharistic piety. They shouldn't have been putting it in their crops and all of those things. And as a Protestant engaged in these dialogues, I'm encouraged by that. But for those that might be curious, like, what's the line? What can a Catholic faithfully say of, hey, there are mistakes here, maybe it was implemented wrong, or maybe we've made transubstantiation do more lifting than it had to at times, but fundamentally, what does a Catholic have to affirm about the Eucharist? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. So okay. Well, I want to do two different. Remind me about the final question. What does a Catholic have to affirm? If I don't get to it in what I'm about to say, I want to make a broader point about. I think it's about personality types to a degree. This might be drawing the line too starkly, and I'm sure there's shades of gray here. But imagine two personality types, one of which is most interested in critiquing, in defending its own tribe or group or identity, and another type which worries that actually costs us credibility, and so instead invests a lot of time and energy in critiquing their own side to try get clarity. Now, those people, the second people, are really, well, both groups seem like a threat to the other group, right? They're both undermining our credibility. One group is not taking a stand strong enough, and another group is taking a stand on the wrong ground and making us all look bad, right? You can see this in debates between pro-lifers. You can see this in, when political parties are trying to decide about outreach to people outside their bounds. And so I think that often we can be willing to countenance the exaggerations of those who agree with us and like make excuses for them, right? And maybe there's time for that, right? Maybe just like judging the mistakes of popular piety can be overdone, right? Like simple people who love Jesus and who get their doctrine of the Trinity all garbled up. Well, how much time should we put into, critiquing them as modalists, right? Which we all, every feast of the Trinity, we all share our videos on YouTube about that's modalism, Patrick. If you've seen that one, it's hilarious. Google that's modalism, Patrick, if you haven't seen it yet. So I think there's this. It's like, is there pastoral sensibility there, or what is it where we have to be like, how much ground are we willing to give to our own, and then are we being fair when we apply that to people outside our group, right? Because I think if your instinct is to be pretty generous and open for the mistakes of people who agree with you, if you're gonna have that same hermeneutic for the people who disagree, God bless you. And if you want to be, rigorous with those who disagree with you, but you're just as rigorous with those who agree, God bless you. The problem is when you apply different standards to your own group and to the other group, right? And then dialogue becomes impossible because it feels like it's not in good faith. And so I think all of us, no matter what our predilection is, need to say, am I being fair in applying the same kind of standards to the other group? So that's the broader point that I think of when you bring that. Now, your last question was, so what do Catholics have to affirm? They have to affirm that God really gives himself to us in the Eucharist. They probably have to affirm more than that. They have to affirm that it's a real change, that it's not a physical change. There's a bunch of specifications. I write another book. But in terms of transubstantiation, a Catholic, this is really interesting. Trent doesn't exactly say you have to believe transubstantiation. What Trent says instead, and I'm not aware of any other instance in church teaching where Trent says this, and it goes to the point at the very beginning of our conversation about mystery. Trent says transubstantiation is the most apt way we have of speaking about this. That's a fascinating way to frame it, right? Because it acknowledges an inadequacy. Even in the very formulation, it acknowledges some lack of attaining to the mystery perfectly in words, right? This is the best we got, guys. So a Catholic doesn't have to say there's nothing about transubstantiation that has ever been misunderstood or abused, or that might even properly understood that doesn't risk some confusion. All that kind of, Catholic can say all of those things. All that Trent requires of us dogmatically as Catholics is to say, this is the best we got. This is the best articulation in the Catholic tradition. Now, if you want to be really picky as a historian, you could say, as of 1562, this was the best we had. It didn't say it will necessarily always and forever be the most apt, though I think it's pretty clear that no one is saying that Catholics have bettered it since. We made a couple stabs at it in the 20th century with transsignification and transfinalization that the Pope said, those work as qualifications of misunderstandings of transubstantiation. They don't work as replacements of it. So, I hope that, feel free to follow up if I haven't really nailed your question, but it's an interesting case study, actually, in what Catholics are asked to believe.
Could I just interact with that just a little bit, Austin? So I just want to state, first of all, my appreciation and agreement with the first of the 2 points Brett was making there about just, are we more stricter on the other team than our own team, and those kinds of questions. And we keep saying this, but it's so important, is we live in an age of increasing tribalism. And it is so important for us to have charity for people with whom we disagree. That is part of how we show Jesus Christ to people watching us. It is not icing on the cake. It's not a secondary issue. And so for people who make YouTube comments, we need to remember this, that the comments we make should be charitable. You can strongly disagree, but we should remember to be charitable. On the second of the 2 comments there, I would see one of the funny feelings I have in ecumenical dialogue sometimes is it feels like the Roman Catholic Church says something over here. I'm concerned about it. And then I talk to these contemporary Catholics who are like wonderful, salt of the earth, amazing, great people. And they're saying, oh, but what it really means is this. And it sounds a lot nicer. And I'm like, well, how do I get from here to here? Because I would say that what the Catholic Church requires is more thorough going with regard to transubstantiation. In Canon 2 of the 13th session of the Council of Trent, it says, if anyone says that in the sacred and holy sacrament of the Eucharist, the substance of the bread and wine remains conjointly with the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, and denies that wonderful and singular change of the whole substance of the bread into the body and the whole substance of the wine into the blood, the appearance is only of bread and wine remaining, which change the Catholic Church most aptly calls transubstantiation, that's what you referenced, let him be anathema. Now, part of my bewilderment with Catholic teaching on various points is I take anathemas seriously. I think of Galatians 1 as the paradigmatic anathema, and I know how anathemas were understood at like Nicaea 2, for example. Sometimes people try to downplay anathemas today as though they're just warnings or it's a separation from the church, but not a separation from God and things like this. And I think historically they were understood as a separation from God, okay? So at least in the main, maybe there's exceptions to that. So I understand myself to be anathematized several times over by the Catholic Church. And I don't really know what to do with that. You know, I meet Catholics and I think these are wonderful people and I see Christ in them. But there's these sticking points of these historical, like, pegs in the ground that can't move because they're magisterial teaching. And this canon is one example. When we talk about the Eucharist as a sacrifice, we'll talk about masses for the dead. There's another thing I'm anathematized for because I think the Eucharist is only for the living. And that's out of Trent too. So I guess I'm just articulating my sense of uncertainty as to what to do with that.
Right. No, that's a great point. I mean, one of the things about reading Trent is some people read only the anathemas. I mean, they got all the zingers in them, right? And it's interesting to read the anathemas after what we might call the positive treatment of the subject, right? So you have this, paragraph or several paragraphs on the thing, and then what follows are anathemas, which are ways of saying like, well, they're saying what you're saying on the one hand, right? This removes you from communion with the church and maybe even communion with God. But what they're saying with respect to the previous paragraph is, let's make sure you understand clearly what's being said here. They're ways of offering these kind of forceful clarifications on the one hand, but they're also pointed, right? So that one that you mentioned, the conjointly, that was aimed squarely at a position that was held by actual historical actors, right? And the work of ecumenism is often on these questions really about getting your terms just right. So there's an article by Ratzinger that he wrote in the 60s on transubstantiation that I quoted it so extensively in the book that we had to get permission from the publisher. And in it, he says something like, when you see what Lutherans really mean by this consubstantiation. Now, I know lots of Lutherans don't like that term, but anyways, we can leave that aside for now. It forms no, I don't have the exact words in the front of me, no contradiction or outright sort of, it's not exclusive of our interpretation of transubstantiation if you're using the words in the way that they affirm to us that they mean to be using them. So it leads to a lot of careful linguistic work, right? In the anathema you just read, the one about the real work that has to be done is work on substance. I mean, depending on what a person means when they use the word substance or not, you may or may not be anathematized. And that's it, the documents that we're all responsible to on the Catholic side, Trent, but various statements of faith on the Protestant side in the 16th century do kind of peg us down and require a lot of careful work if we want to find out if they actually apply to us or not. In this book here, what is it? This is an important book on this question. It's called The Condemnations of the Reformation Era. Do they still divide? And it looks at mutual condemnation. So condemnations from Trent and condemnations of Catholics by Protestants as well. And it's careful work on exactly those kinds of things, because the way we talked about each other did not set us up well to engage. And that's why, my book spends a lot of time in what you might call the weeds of this, what happened to this word that we use differently. Because if it's actually true, if I'm right that we use the word differently, then you can actually work through that anathema. But if we're all using the words in the straightforward way as we imagined for 450 some years, then it is kind of all or nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope that's right. I would like for that to be right. And I do think that it is valid. We can say, what did they mean by that? And where were they misunderstanding each other by that? And there are ways we can sort of come closer together today. And I think that's your book is a wonderful effort at that and showing ways we can come closer together. I think if I were to step back and look at the big picture out of the weeds for a second, the issue of valid ministry and thereby valid Eucharist, and the issue of transubstantiation and having to articulate it in that particular framework, having to articulate real presence in that Aristotelian ontology, substance, accidents, distinction. Those are, to me, two areas where we can't come totally together. They seem like I'm open to looking, we keep talking about and keep working at it, but at this point, I can't see how those can be overcome. And I, with transubstantiation, it looks to me like one of those things where there's a more particular option that has been dogmatized and selected by the Roman Catholic Church that does depart from what I understand to be more of a Catholicity, and what I see in the East and what I see in the Fathers. And so again, it's like, well, I'm open to let's keep talking and see where we can come together. I'm just there's a wariness of because the thing is, like, the language there in that anathema conjointly, that was targeted at people that I consider to be my theological forefathers. That because I've used that language. It's a both and. It's from Theodoret. It's Chalcedonian. It's bread and Christ. And
Right.
So maybe they weren't thinking of Gavin Ortlund there, but they're thinking of something that's pretty close to my view. And I just sort of look at that and say, gosh, that seems like a sticking point.
Right. So I think that what's actually required for mutual agreement, I don't know if mutual agreement's even the right word. What would be necessary for this not to be church dividing? That's what I mean. What would be necessary for this not to be church dividing is not that every Protestant sign up for transubstantiation, but that Protestants don't deny it as a valid expression of the mystery, right? So, and I think the anathema can actually be read that way, right? It's not that you must affirm this thing that we call most apt in every specific detail. Is that you cannot deny the specifics of what we're trying to say. And so if you understand what substance actually meant for Thomas, and Trent is actually kind of skips over 300 years of people after Thomas who tried to articulate it differently and goes right with Thomas's articulation. So that much is clear. If you understand what Thomas meant by substance and you still say that's a heresy, well, that's not going to work. But if you say, oh, now that and this is what lots of Protestants who've read my book have said is, now that I've read this, I've moved not to full affirmation of transubstantiation, but moved from thinking it's just wrong to thinking it's a legit exploration of the mystery that does the work it does well, even if I would prefer some other articulation as complementary or as better in keeping with my own tradition, or even as like less prone to the kind of misunderstandings to which transubstantiation is prone, or what, right? Any number of those kind of qualifications. But if a Protestant were to be able to say, transubstantiation is a legit theology of real presence, I think that would suffice for it to not be a church dividing doctrine. It's tricky because like the same thing doesn't apply with the East, because the East doesn't have in its founding identity a rejection of transubstantiation. They just never needed it, right? And then, some encounters, in the 17th or 18th or 19th century, some people in the East liked it, but the majority of the East said it's an over-rationalizing of the mystery. Mm. And Catholics have been like, well, it's too bad you don't understand us, and we think that's unfair, but whatever. Like, we're really casual about the East on this, which is people wonder, why are we so casual about the East and so picky with the Protestants? And I think it's because the Protestant founding documents, like the Anglican Articles, for instance, the 39 Articles, just explicitly say no to it. So then we're in the same position as you articulated with respect to the Anathemas of Trent.
Yeah, well, and Luther's position himself was to exactly what you just said: leave transubstantiation on the table, just don't require it as a dogma. And I would like to agree with you, because I want to make as much progress as we can. But I would have this feeling in my heart that I'm not giving a good faith reading to this canon. Like, I'm not really giving it what it means, because I don't read it as saying, and I could be reading it wrong, but honestly, in my sincere feeling about it is that it's not saying if anybody denies that this is one option on the table, but rather it's saying if anybody denies that this is what happens, that the substance is transubstantiated. That's how I read it. And so it could be reading.
I would actually agree with you, but I just don't think those are exclusive options. If it's saying if anybody denies that the substance is transubstantiated, let him be anathema. I don't want to come behind and not read it in good faith with what they meant when they said that. And I just have this feeling like I don't think they meant it as like, oh, they're just denying it's an option on the table that could be acceptable. Maybe you can appreciate the worry here of you want to read this according to how it was understood at the time and according to how it was intended. Right. No, I don't think that they meant it's one option on the table. I don't see those as exclusive. I think this is real slippery. So I think a fair reading is, if you don't deny this, which is called this, right? That's what it said, like, which is, aptly called this, or I don't have it right in front of me, but if you don't deny this, which is called this, it says if you do deny. If you do deny, then you're anathema. So it seems to me that if you don't deny, then we're not demanding something terribly specific further.
My problem is I do deny that the whole substance of the bread is transubstantiated into the whole substance of Christ. I do, in fact, deny that. Not that I deny that it's an acceptable option within the church. I would not say that, someone can't hold that view. And I would say, like Luther, if someone holds that view, God bless you, it's really tricky trying to figure this out. But I do deny personally that the bread in substance is transubstantiated. I believe it is conjointly present. So I just feel like I would be kind of getting around. It's kind of like they're nailing it down, and I feel I'm saying, here's an escape hatch. And I want to treat these historical documents in good faith. That's where it's like in the ecumenical dialogue, it's like I want to make as much progress as we can, but I also want to be really honest about where those sticking points remain. And the issue of transubstantiation, I do see that as a sticking point.
Yeah. Well, if you do deny it, even now here's my ego, right? Even having read my book and seeing how the word doesn't mean what it meant, right? Even after I put in all that work, you still deny it. No, I mean, I'm all jesting aside, but I mean, if you actually do deny it, if you think that's wrong, if you think that's not if that misrepresents what's going on, then there is something that's not yet worked out.
Yeah. Okay, and I appreciate that. And and if I could just reiterate that your book, I mean, if it helps, it definitely, I learned a ton from it. So it's not that you didn't maneuver me at all. I just page after page, I'm just like, wow, this is really well crafted. But yeah, I mean, I think it's okay to just get to points where we kind of acknowledge, like, hey, we need to keep talking because we have a difference on this point, even where we can agree on this other point.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the most fascinating things about ecumenical dialogue, well done, people worry that it's compromise or least common denominator. But what it actually does when it's done well is it actually manages to highlight just where the difference actually is. Because we shouldn't be divided by anything less than what we really disagree about as essential to the gospel. and when we're divided over misunderstandings, I mean, it's such a tragedy. It's still a tragedy if we're divided over proper understandings, but there's an integrity there. But if we're divided over identities and misrepresentations of one another, I mean, that's like inexcusable, actually. Yeah.
That was fantastic to see that work out in real time and get to really narrow in on, okay, there's so much agreement, but there is this sticking point. And I think, conversations like these are just the beginning, right? That once you can identify those things, then you can keep working out those things, and maybe they never meet. And I think that's a reality of ecumenical dialogue, is having an acceptance of that, but also to the greatest extent possible, figuring out not the least common denominator in terms of what we agree with, but the most key things that we disagree with, and being able to work those out. So
right.
I'm enjoying getting to see this happen in real time. Are you all still good with a little transition here into the question of sacrifice? Good on time there?
Sounds good to me.
I'll throw in one quick comment, and then yes. There's an important concept in ecumenical dialogue called differentiated consensus. And the most famous example of this is the Joint Declaration on Justification. And it's a way of saying we agree on a lot of things, and where we disagree, we're going to try to be really clear, but we're also going to be able to say, when we say this, by it, we do not mean this. And when they say that, by it, they do not mean that. And what it allows the different articulations to do is to serve actually as healthy warnings against the most likely misunderstanding of the other side. So instead of simply being an irreconcilable point, it's okay. Yes, we still prefer our own articulation here. And the reason we do is because we're worried that if you push the other one too far, you end up with this thing that none of us want, actually. And so even those places where you come to the like, oh, we can't quite solve this, there's probably something in Gavin's hesitation about affirming the change of substance that a Catholic can actually affirm in the way of saying, yeah, because if the understanding goes too far, it's going to get us to something that even we don't mean to say, right? So I just wanted to throw that out there, that's like, once you get down to the nub, yeah, you can keep working on the nub, but the nub itself is illustrative of something, often of things that we agree on. Often we have different practices and different language to try to affirm common sensitivities. And I think maybe that's a lead into sacrifice, because I think on sacrifice that actually happens a lot. So anyway, I hope that was helpful.
You've done my job for me, Dr. Salkeld. I don't even have to make the transition. Let's talk about the Eucharist as a sacrifice. Dr. Ortlund, we'll start with you. And rather than breaking these into kind of two questions, as I did in the outline, I think we can address them conjointly. Is the Eucharist a sacrifice, and if so, in what way?
Yes, it's probably good to address these questions together, because if I were to just do the first one, it would be very brief. And everything hangs upon the second part. In what sense? And I think that many people may not be aware of this, but historically, Luther and Cranmer and major Protestant theologians and confessions and so forth, up through B.B. Warfield and others, do call the Eucharist a sacrifice. And this is one of many areas where I want to try to acknowledge where contemporary Protestant practice has often just maybe fallen away so far in the other extreme that we've really we really can be enriched by listening with humility to the other side, even where we don't agree. We see, oh wow, we've actually gone too far in this other direction, and we've actually lost touch with our own heritage in some respects. So my answer is yes, we can speak of the Eucharist as a sacrifice. Everything hinges upon what is meant by that. Martin Chemnitz, the Lutheran theologian, identified 6 different senses in which we can refer to the Eucharist as a sacrifice, and he identified 7 different senses in which the Church Fathers spoke of the Eucharist as a sacrifice. And as Brett points out in his book, in the current ecumenical conversations, this point actually generally comes out into an agreement. You don't have too much resistance still on just the basic point, if we can call it a sacrifice. Now, what does that mean? Well, I would say, first of all, I want to defend the Reformers. I think that in their context, the meaning of it, what it means for it to be a sacrifice, had gotten warped into something that was deeply problematic. And I think that, I think in the minds of many laity, and even you can hear people argue for it at times, that there was a conception of Christ being sort of re-sacrificed. And I think that that doesn't represent the Catholic view officially, but I think they're seeing this, and they're also seeing some abuses in the exercise of private masses and masses for the dead and the financial associations with that. They're seeing real problems. Okay, so I want to defend them, but I also want to acknowledge, I think the trajectory of Protestantism has been such that I think for many particular Protestant churches, we need to kind of come back and talk more and get in touch with our own roots, first of all, and then talk across to the other side as well. So if we were to say, okay, so where do we agree that it's a sacrifice? Where do we disagree? If I were to try to be as generous as possible to both sides, I think I'd say something like this, that we're both trying to say that real presence is not generic. It's Christ being present in his saving activity. So this is why we say it's his body and blood, and not just Christ generally, where it's in his sacrificial death that Christ is present in some sense. And so there's this once for all sacrifice on the cross that we all want to protect the finality and sufficiency of that. And the Protestant concern is at times the Catholic views have punctured the finality and sufficiency of that, but maybe there's ways we can come together on that now. But that once for all event is somehow applied or extended into the recipient in the actual moment of reception. Different people have cashed this out differently. Warfield uses the language of application. So the sacrifice of Christ is applied to the receiver of the Eucharist. Thomas Torrance talks about it as a participation. Somehow we are, and I just read an article by Stephen Holmes arguing for something like this. He uses this word where we're somehow participating in the sacrifice. So it's really tricky, okay? It's really tricky because we don't want to go too far and puncture the finality and sufficiency of Christ's death on the cross as a sacrifice, but there is something going on where it's kind of applied or whatever verb we want to use. So let me read how Chemnitz puts it, if I might. He says, I think this is helpful. He uses the language of application and sealing. He says, quote, the fathers, he's summarizing the fathers and Cyprian and others, and he says, this is the Lutheran theologian. He says, the fathers call the body and blood of the Lord, which are present in the supper, a saving sacrifice, because that sacrifice which was once offered on the cross, the body and blood of the Lord, is present, dispensed, offered, and taken in the Lord's Supper, so that the power and efficacy of this offering, once made on the cross, is applied and sealed individually to all who receive it in faith. Now, this is what my basic approach for ecumenical dialogue is: when in doubt, quote Martin Chemnitz, because I find him to be a very pointed thinker, and he's very helpful. So his language of application and sealing I find helpful. Now, what I basically say is, when I listen to my Catholic friends as carefully as I can today, they're saying something like that. So I want to be as open-hearted as possible to see where do we come together. The two worries are, number one, masses for the dead. That's one of those sticking points where I just don't see how we can come together on that. And that's, again, with an anathema there at the Council of Trent, as I mentioned. And then also with this language, the way it's understood at times, I want to keep thinking about it and keep understanding, but at this point, there's still this worry when the adjective propitiatory is used, particularly with reference to those already deceased. If we're saying it's one thing if it's done in a commemoration of the deceased, but as a propitiatory sacrifice for dead Christians, I can't agree to that. That seems to me to be wrong. And so that would be, even at the language of Trent, there is language about in the Mass, Christ is contained and bloodlessly immolated, or that older translations will say bloodlessly sacrificed. So there's this sense of, it seems like as I'm listening to the Catholic, my dilemma is, gosh, I want to see where we agree, and I'm hearing language that sounds like we really agree as I'm listening to the ecumenical dialogue, But then there's also language at times that seems to veer off to where it's saying something more than just an application or sealing or participation in the sacrifice of Christ. It seems to say, so the adjective propitiatory, I don't think I can get on board with that. I just don't know how to make peace with it, but I'll keep listening. But so we agree on some big picture stuff, but there's these sticking points, and those are two of the ones that I worry about and wouldn't know how to bridge.
Right. Yeah, so I think the quote from Chemnitz could have been written by any contemporary Catholic theologian. I mean, there's not a word I could hear that isn't what Catholics believe about the Eucharist as sacrifice. Question of masses offered for the dead almost feels to me like part of a broader conversation about prayer for the dead and generally the doctrine of purgatory and that sort of thing. To try to answer it in brief would just be to say that Catholics think that basically what you can do for the living, you can do for the dead in terms of prayer for a brother or sister in Christ, but that, I mean, there's a lot of other connected pieces that are maybe part of another conversation there. So maybe I'll, and feel free to push me on them a little, but I worry that it's just big and we're probably running short on time. So permit me to go a little bit to Austin's original question. Is it a sacrifice and in what way? You won't be surprised, as surprised by my answer as maybe by Gavin's, which is yes, it is. But in what way? And I would affirm, what Chemnitz said. I mean, the breakthrough on the ecumenical dialogues on this, which was remarkably fast. Like Lutherans and Catholics agreed on this in like 1967, and Vatican II that introduced Catholics into ecumenical dialogue wrapped up in 1965. I mean, it was fast. Anglican Catholic agreement by the early 1980s, multilateral agreement in the early 1980s with the World Council of Churches document, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry. Again, not complete agreement, but a kind of a differentiated consensus, but lots of things that we could say in common. I wonder if part of what makes it hard for us to understand one another, and maybe this goes to the question about propitiatory, is different operative soteriologies, different ways of thinking about what we mean by calling the cross a sacrifice in the first place. So it seems to me that if our basic understanding of the cross is Christ doing something, if Christ is taking punishment that we were going to get because, well, it would be maybe a bit too flippant to say because God was angry. But if the basic picture is what we call sort of penal substitutionary atonement, calling the Eucharist a sacrifice, I think, becomes really hard to make any sense of, because what happened on the cross was done for you instead of you. And so it's already like the finality of it does not admit of any application. But the language of application that we saw from Chemnitz seems to imagine something a little different than a strict penal substitutionary atonement, because it imagines that in some way I participate in this. So it's not just done as a replacement of me, but it's done in a way that kind of brings me along. And I think Catholics have a kind of liturgical sense that what's happening at the Eucharist is our participation in Christ's sacrifice on the cross, but actually even that is not the final reality. The final reality is the inner life of the Trinity, which is a life of mutual self-giving and of not holding anything back. And the cross is the kind of transposition of that inner life of the Trinity onto a sinful history. And humans are called into that life of God, but can't ever get there on our own. Right? We just screw it up all the time. All of our sacrifices, however well-intentioned, are compromised by our own sinfulness and selfishness and confusion and whatever else. And so if the picture of the cross is not so much a replacement, And this is Eastern language, but it's also patristic language. If the cross is Christ's perfect act of worship that we are brought into, then I think you have a framework where talking about the Eucharist as a sacrifice makes sense. And then you have this other language where a Protestant kind of downplaying of sacrifice, where, well, I'll admit that it's a sacrifice of praise, as if that's like a small thing, right? And then they say, actually, if Christ's death, if a good way of thinking about Christ's death on the cross is as an act of worship in the first place, then a sacrifice of praise isn't actually a small thing. It's actually the whole thing. And if we call Eucharist thanksgiving, which often, that theme gets downplayed. Like Eucharist means thanksgiving in Greek, but we talk about all these other things as if they matter more, like real presence or sacrifice. And then Thanksgiving is just like what, like some notional thing. Oh, and by the way, thank you. Or is it actually like inscribing us in a whole life of gratitude that was what we were meant for in the first place? Like if it takes on the sort of cosmic dimensions that I think it deserves, then I think sacrifice just becomes like obvious as a way for talking about the Eucharist. So I wonder if there's not broader. Now, I don't even know where either of you stand on penal substitutionary atonement, but I just feel like it doesn't actually give us good lenses for thinking about the Eucharist as sacrifice. And some of these other ways of talking about the cross just make it much more intuitive.
One quick comment would be I read what you sent out to us on this topic, so I appreciated getting your thoughts on this whole question as well. And with penal substitutionary atonement, one of the things there is that term can mean really different things in different contexts.
Sure,
and so
yeah.
I would affirm penal substitutionary atonement in a sense, in that I would see that there is the heart of the atonement is substitution, and there is a penal element to that. That is, there's a penalty that Christ steps in and pays. And I don't think that's all. I think the problems come when we construe that in a way that is overly simple or vindictive of God the Father or something, or when we flatten out the atonement. In my Theological Retrieval for Evangelicals book, I have a chapter where I'm basically trying to say, let's take Irenaeus and recapitulation, and let's take Anselm and satisfaction, and let's just put them together like two puzzle pieces, and actually they really fit well. And so I'm trying to say the atonement is really rich and multifaceted. And so the penal element is just one piece of the larger whole. But I guess it seems to me like we could affirm a penal substitutionary view like that, or we could not. Or even if you did, you could still see that as harmonious with a sacrificial understanding of the Eucharist in some sense, where you're participating in this in some sense. So that'd be something that'd be kind of interesting to explore. I think if I were to try to isolate in my thinking on the spot, where do we disagree here? It looks to me like I'm wanting to say something like the Eucharist is a sacrifice in that it's a kind of extension, actualization, application, etc. of the one-time sacrifice of Christ. And I do just have these worries. I keep listening. One of the last thing I want to do is kind of throw the gauntlet down and then 5 years later realize, oh, that's what they mean, like that kind of thing. So I keep listening, but it just looks like the Catholic Church is going further than that, because further than application or extension or actualization of or something like that, because you find these statements like in the Catechism, it says something like the sacrifice of the cross and the sacrifice of the Eucharist are one sacrifice, and therefore it's propitiatory. And I'm looking at that, or I'm looking at the language of bloodlessly sacrificed or bloodlessly immolated at Trent. I'm just saying, I guess I wouldn't be laying all my cards on the table if I didn't kind of articulate this is a worry area here. Right. It looks like it's going further than what I would understand to be really actually what a lot of the fathers are talking about when they talk about the Eucharist as a sacrifice. So I'm trying to articulate maybe there where we are looking at it differently.
Right. Yeah. So I'll try to take those two things in turn. Yeah. On penal substitutionary atonement, I would agree that there's certainly an acceptable way of doing it, and the best way is to not isolate it from the rest of the tradition, right? Because there's clearly scriptural warrant for talking about substitution and talking about penalty. I don't think there's scriptural warrant for saying that's the only way to talk about the cross. I mean, the scriptural witness and then the witness of the fathers is just a wealth of metaphors. Paul just sort of he'll take something from legal proceedings, and then he'll take some, the redeeming of a slave, and then in the patristic period you get health metaphors, medicine. I mean, it's very rich and not exclusive. And I think the narrowing to penal substitutionary atonement, the one big danger is if it makes God look vindictive. But then if it's isolated from the rest of the tradition. So now I want to read this chapter that you referenced in your book to see what you do with Irenaeus and Anselm, because I think that would be interesting. And I do agree with you that it's possible to affirm the Eucharistic sacrifice with a penal substitutionary view, but I think it's a lot less intuitive. I think it takes more work to make it fit. Whereas I think it's quite intuitive if you have this sense of worship and thanksgiving as part of what was being done for us that we couldn't do for ourselves on the cross, and then we participate in that in the Mass. But they're not exclusive by any stretch. On the other question though, does Catholicism go farther than what you're willing to affirm? So the preferred term in Catholic theology for the relationship between the Mass as sacrifice, or the Eucharistic sacrifice, and the cross is representation. That's the preferred term. And I would expect that's not particularly problematic, representation. It does say that they're one. Yeah, that's there in the Catechism for sure. And I think the key idea is, and this is where the breakthrough was in ecumenical dialogue. It was in the celebration of the Passover, where Jewish people use the present tense when they're celebrating the Passover, right? The youngest person says, "What makes this night different than any others?" And the oldest person says, "This very night the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt." And it was that sense of what Jesus and the disciples would have understood themselves to be doing at the Last Supper, of making present God's saving act in history to us here and now. That when biblical scholars were able to make that clear, Catholic and Protestant, that was a real key to unlock the door for agreement on Eucharistic sacrifice, because it was this sense that this event, God's saving act in the past, is really present to us here today. And so that's why sacrifice is tied in with real presence too. It's not just our meaning making or our memories, but it's God's real action brought present to us. And so in that sense, we'll say they are mystically one, and we would go beyond that and say that's also mystically one with the inner life of the Trinity. This lamb sacrificed before the foundation of the world kind of idea, right? That's what we're tapping into. The cross is sort of the point in history that humanity is given access to that reality. But then in the Eucharist, that's represented for us all the time. So whatever was there, if up to and including a propitiatory sacrifice, if we agree that that's what was at the cross, then that is also present, if in a different way. And this is the bloodless language, that was common in the 16th, 17th centuries. That's a way of trying to distinguish, right? It's really the same thing in one sense, in this mystical sense, but we also need to be able to distinguish in some way and say how it's different. And as a sacramental representation, it is bloodless. So that was the function of that term, bloodless. It's almost an optical illusion. It almost makes it look like it's doubling down, when it's actually trying to introduce a distinction that I think might be important for Protestants.
Well, let me just say, for Protestants watching this, the need for just really careful listening on this point. I would have to say, whenever we're in these conversations, you try to speak to your own tradition as well. I do feel that there's been a lot of misunderstanding on the Protestant side of this. Even for those Protestants who will still disagree, we want to be really careful about what is and isn't being said here, because I think it often is understood in this kind of Jesus is dying afresh in some way, and that isn't fair, and so we need to be careful with that. And I think I'll probably kind of bring it to a close here in my own comments, but just to flag one thing that maybe we keep working on in other dialogues as well. The issue of masses for the dead, the reason that kind of brings things up for me, questions, is not just because of different views of like purgatory and but because it speaks to whether the efficacy of the sacrament is personal or can be done on behalf of someone else. So that's part of the language in one of those anathemas at Trent as well, is about if they say it only profits him only who receives. And that to me, that would be a point where there'd probably be a disagreement where we want to keep talking about that. But I really appreciate hearing your thoughts on this. It's been really fascinating.
Yeah, well, we're coming up on the 2-hour mark, so I think it is a good time to wrap it. This has been great, and I'd be more than open to, seeing where some of the other things we could talk about, where we might go with that. I think probably the communion of saints and masses for the dead and purgatory might be an interesting angle. I was first introduced to you, Gavin, when a friend of mine tagged me on Twitter with a video you had done on purgatory. And so that's actually when I reached out to Austin and said, maybe Gavin would be a good person. And he had for a conversation, and he had already got there before me. So anyways, yeah, we won't run out of things to talk about, but this has been a delight.
Yeah, it's been awesome. We should definitely do it again. Definitely.
All right. Well, I am happy to be involved if you all would like. This has been a pleasure for me. Thank you all so much for your time today. And thanks to everyone that watches this in the future. There are so many more avenues we could go down. It seems like both of you have landed the plane. I just like real quickly, I think a great kind of question to close this as people walk away having dissected this, but then, and this is probably like the evangelical in me that like needs a point of application for everything. No, but as they walk away from this, probably encouraged at the amount of agreement, and maybe even encouraged by the specificity of where the disagreement is. Kind of how can they participate in helping this out? On the one hand, Gavin, I'd love for you to talk to, because I know, or at least I can imagine, there's a lot of Protestant pastors who watch your content and who I would think, I don't know if you'll shy at this at all, but look up to you as a pastor and what you're doing here. And what advice would you give to those who come from like a Baptist tradition and they're saying, like, man, like I want to retrieve the history of the church and I want to reflect that in practice, but this feels really different. What is something they could do, or people in the congregation to have more reverence for what's going on here? And then Dr. Salkeld, what could Catholics do to maybe avoid some of the bad articulations or some of the practices that aren't necessarily faithfully Catholic and make Protestants squeamish? Do those questions make sense to you guys? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Ortlund, would you like to start there?
Sure, yeah. I want to say, first of all, I can sympathize with Protestants who could hear, first of all, the very word Eucharist. That right out of the gate might have set off alarm bells for some. Like, what the heck is the Eucharist? They've not, they don't have a category for that term, and so to simply use that. But of course, that's a biblical term, and it's fine to use that. But I understand that the way we're talking about this can give alarm bells to people. I think some of those things are just things of language where we can work through, and it's just so. To answer the question, the first thing I would say is try not to be threatened. I understand there can be this feeling of like, well, we got to hold the fortress, and I don't want to take away from that. We do need to maintain truth. We should contend for truth. However, humility is essential, and that means listening, and that means being open to adjusting and changing in our understanding. And the fact is, these issues are really complicated, and they're not simple. So in the posture of not being threatened, if someone is really worried that perhaps developing a more robust view of the sacraments in general and the Lord's Supper in particular is going to lead away from evangelical Protestant distinctives, an initial encouragement would be, in order to do that, you actually could do a lot of that simply by reading the Puritans. So, they're going to be safe, right? And they have a very rich theology of the Lord's Supper. You could also read Calvin, I mean, these other guys, I mean, this book right here has a great introduction as well, and then it's Vermigli's stuff. And then the book by Thomas Cranmer, I mean, just those two books alone, I think, would open up people's minds to see, oh, there's possible avenues forward here that I don't need to see as like a compromise in any way. So that would be, and then also just with Scripture, I think that the way that Paul describes the Lord's Supper in his first epistle to the Corinthians seems to me to, teach us we're dealing with something very serious here. People are dying when they do it unworthily. Okay, so that already, and I think a Zwinglian could account for that in some way, but I'm just saying we don't need to, we can just stay within our own customary resources to start that process. And then I would say the only other thing I would say is just, as a Protestant, we are going to want to look to Scripture ultimately as our ultimate sort of North Star. And we are going to want to do it prayerfully and carefully. And along the way, I think one thing that can be so helpful is simply dialoguing with other traditions like this. I mean, think of how productive this may be for some people to realize some of the nuances in the discussion, and then dialoguing with other more sacramental Protestant traditions as well, perhaps some of the Eastern traditions, and simply becoming aware can help people. And then I think just taking it step by step and biblically seeing where can we step into something more here. And my last encouragement would be, we got to do this. It's too important to say, oh, that's not something we need to work on. And people are hungering for it. There's a huge hunger for a rich experience of Jesus Christ in the Lord's Supper. There's a huge hunger for that, and rightly so. And so this is not something we can just kind of say, oh, I'll get to that, when life is less busy. We got to take this very seriously.
Yeah, one of the things that was fascinating for me when I was doing my research is, like, I had expected to find a lot more I disagreed with in Luther and Calvin. I mean, early on, I put out a kind of a Facebook post about something, and when I had started reading Thomas, I hadn't read in Calvin yet. I put out something on Thomas to counter, and the reason this is an answer to your question, Austin, is to counter some misunderstandings in the Catholic community. So I put this articulation from Thomas, and people accused me of Calvinism. I said that's not Calvinism, it's straight from Thomas Aquinas. And far be it from me to affirm anything that heretic Calvin would say, right? Well, I didn't quite say that. Anyways, then I was surprised, when I went and read Calvin and all the secondary literature that's like, oh yeah, Calvin is very structurally similar to Aquinas on sign and signified. And sure enough, the thing I was accused of being a Calvinist for was quite Calvinist, but it was also right out of Thomas, right? And so I think one thing for Catholics is we should celebrate when Gavin is inviting Protestants to go back to their sources, because when I went to the Protestant sources, I was like, man, if every Calvinist actually followed Calvin on this, we'd be really close, So and to me, it's part of this larger thing about identity politics, right? I was called a Calvinist as if it was an insult, when neither me nor the other person knew what Calvin said. I mean, how stupid is that? Mm-hmm. And so if we're engaged, like, it's important to fortify our Christian identity, including within our own traditions, Baptist identity, Catholic identity, and I think it's important that our children have a sense of who they are in a world that wants to take away any anchors and offer these ersatz identities all over the place because no one knows who they are. I mean, I think identity is really important on the one hand, and on the other hand, certain ways of affirming our identity over against others, especially within the body of Christ, can be basically pathological. And so I would want Catholics to say, on the one hand, a strong affirmation of Catholic identity and Catholic faith in the real presence and all this stuff is great, but don't let that become something that blinds you to other Christians, even to your own tradition. And this is the worst, is when I will quote Thomas to people and they're sure that I'm a heretic because they've doubled down on some sense of Catholic identity as basically anti-Protestant. And then when their own tradition speaks, they can't even hear it because we become so closed off. So can we find that balance between a rich affirmation of our own identity and something that's not defensive and suspicious of others? And to me, that's part of a bigger question of like, what is freedom in Christ? Because freedom in Christ is not needing to protect yourself against other people all the time. And I think if the church can offer anything in this contemporary context where we're in self-protect mode and under threat by the other all the time, is a model for living freely outside of those categories. Because I think people are just getting crushed by this. I think social media is a hyper accelerator of this kind of thing. Our soundbite politics are driving us all bananas. And I mean, I could talk about this for much too long, but what I see sometimes in myself, but what I see in correspondence I get, in attacks I get, is this defensiveness and this fearfulness that makes the assertion of Catholic identity into a weapon instead of an invitation and a gift for the world. So I don't know if that was too meta, but that's where my mind went.
That's wonderful. Thank you both so much for the time, the effort, and the care that you put into this dialogue, the posture of really wanting to understand one another while being faithful to your own traditions. It's been a joy to get to be a small part of this. So thank you both so much. I encourage all of you that watch this to go check out their work, both their books and their podcast, YouTube channel, respectively. Definitely check those things out. I've been blessed by all of the above, and I'll close as I always do by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos, but far more importantly than that, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.